Good to have you back with us on Ed Schultz News and Commentary. So North Korea, how serious is it? Well, it was serious enough for the United Nations Security Council to issue a strong statement on Wednesday condemning North Korea's test of a nuclear weapon. And, of course, on the campaign trail, it's great fodder. So let's go to the Republican leader right now in Iowa. This is Ted Cruz talking about there's no doubt that this is only going to get worse with these players.
Listen, North Korea is an incredibly difficult situation now because of the colossal mistakes that began with the Clinton administration. When you allow a megalomaniacal maniac to acquire nuclear weapons and now potentially a hydrogen weapon, it makes it all the more dangerous and difficult to deal with them. We ought to be working with regional allies. We ought to be working with Japan. We ought to be working with South Korea. We ought to be working with Taiwan. And we ought to be working with China to continue to isolate North Korea, to continue to cut off North Korea, to continue to raise the costs of their belligerence.
Joe Cirincione is the president of Plowshares Fund and author of Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. Joe, good to have you with us.
Hey, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
I want your reaction to Ted Cruz's analysis of all of this. I mean, do we have our head in the sand as a country, or are we not working with anybody on North Korea's, what the United Nations says is a security threat?
Well, that might have been actually one of the more sensible things I've heard Ted Cruz say. But what he's essentially saying is what U.S. policy is. Of course, we're working with our allies. Yes, we're working with China, but he doesn't propose in there any actual policy that would make a difference. I actually have to admire him for a little bit of his restraint, because the Wall Street Journal today came out with a ripping editorial calling for regime change in North Korea. That's the way we deal with tyrants. We should overthrow them. You remember that line from the Iraq War. The Washington Post editorial board, also big Iraq War boosters, were calling for stronger military actions, more sanctions, more pressure on North Korea. That kind of policy won't work. Yes, you need pressure, but it's got to be coupled with some incentives. The people who can apply the most pressure are China. That's the country closest to North Korea that controls most of the economic assistance that goes to North Korea. But the country that can provide the most incentives, that's the United States. We have what North Korea wants, which is a relationship with us, a peace treaty with us. We got to be willing to come back to the negotiating table and start talking to them. There's no guarantee of success, but continuing to ignore them is a guarantee that North Korea will continue to test missiles, test nuclear devices, continue to try to ratchet up tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
So you don't think the Obama administration is going to change at all when it comes to North Korea?
I think it no, don't get me wrong. The Obama administration's policy has not worked. It's something they call strategic patience, which is basically we're not going to go back to the table with North Korea until we know they're serious about giving up their nuclear weapons. North Korea said we're not going to give up the nuclear weapons. But that's the point of negotiations. You can't make that a precondition. So the Obama administration policy has failed to stop North Korea's program, just as the Bush administration program failed to stop North Korea's program. Remember, North Korea went nuclear under the Bush-Cheney administration. They first exploded in 2006.
So how serious was this H-bomb? Do you believe it was an H-bomb? Do you believe that this was a credible test and a threat?
No, and I came out early saying this was almost certainly not a hydrogen bomb test. And the reason is we have excellent sensors ringing North Korea, in fact, ringing the globe, thanks to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, which has a global grid of seismic monitors, acoustic monitors, sonar monitors, and atmospheric samplers that can tell us within minutes what a seismic event is. And the signal we got from them was consistent with a nuclear test, so not a man-made, not a conventional explosive, not an earthquake, but it showed that it was a very small nuclear test, about 6 kilotons, 6,000 tons. That's about half the size of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. If it was a hydrogen bomb, you would expect to see that up into the 50 kiloton range. Even a failed hydrogen bomb test would be around 10, 20, 30 kilotons. So right away, most of us concluded this was not a hydrogen bomb test. That's why you saw the White House announce yesterday that the data is inconsistent with the hydrogen bomb test. So that's the good news. They do not have a weapon that would be 100, 1,000 times more powerful than the basic nuclear weapons that they currently have.
So what would a new president do? I mean, give us an opportunity at a strategy shift?
Well,
you heard Trump the other day saying that, China should be more involved, as you just said, and so did Cruz. But then, of course, Trump put a trade policy or trade caveat to it that we got to make trade difficult for China if they don't deal with North Korea. I mean, that's a policy.
Yeah, well, that's fantasy. That we're not going to make trade. My undershirts are from China. We're not going to make trade more difficult for China if they don't cooperate on North Korea. That's nonsense. But here, there's a couple of practical things that we can do independent of whether North Korea cooperates. And so if the senators like Cruz or Rubio are so concerned about the North Korea testing, well, let's strengthen the international barriers to testing. How about the Senate ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which Bill Clinton negotiated, which has been sitting waiting for 20 years. We're never going to test again. We've already done 1,000 tests. We know everything we need to know about it. Let's ratify the treaty. 183 countries already have. We're one of the 5, 6, 10 countries left that haven't actually done it. We could lead the charge in getting those last few countries to ratify it. Number two, you could make permanent this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, which is in limbo right now, waiting for the full entry into force of this test ban treaty. You could fully fund that monitoring system, increase the verification mechanisms we have for detecting people's tests. 3, you could go to the United Nations and declare that a nuclear test is against the peace and is a threat to the peace and security of the world. Strengthen the international norms. That's things we can do to ratchet up the pressure independent of North Korea. But in the end, you're going to have to go to the table and negotiate with North Korea, something the administration has not wanted to do. That is a long shot, but people thought getting a deal with Iran was a long shot 5 years ago when we started trying that. Today, Iran is dismantling its nuclear program. We can do the same with North Korea. You just have to have a persistent, coherent package of pressures and incentives.
Joe Cirincione, always great to visit. Appreciate your time and insight. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Ed.
You bet.